Hello everyone, thank you very much for coming tonight. It's an amazing venue. I haven't really been here before. First time in the National Library for me, and really nice to be here. Hopefully I'll be able to give you some interesting insights into what I've been doing for 20 years and show you a little bit about how that gets done and ways that you could look at doing the same sort of thing if that's what interests you. So after my introduction, I don't need to go through this in too much detail, but I am a board member of the Visual Effects Society, current board member, which is fantastic. The Visual Effects Society is a global society for visual effects practitioners and individuals, and I've been a member of that for many, many years, and it's a very nice society. We're starting to look at trying to build up a section in Singapore to have more sort of a sense of community in the industry. So that's something we're doing. I'm wearing many hats. One of these, and the most important one tonight and at the moment, is the fact that I'm the VFX Program Director at 3D Sense Media School, and I have some of my students in the audience, which is good. I'm amazed that you're here today because you've had me talking to you all day, but well done. And I'm also actually a consultant for a local post-production company called VHQ, where I've been working predominantly for the last 2 years. And I spent most of my time up in Beijing, which I'll talk about in a moment. 20 years goes by very, very quickly in this industry. In fact, I think 20 years goes by very quickly in general. I was originally born in Australia, but I'm also a British citizen, which accounts for my really strange accent that jumps around all over the place. So if I'm not clear or you don't quite understand me, just ask me at the end in the questions. And I've lived in lots of different places, so I like to travel. And I'm now actually resident in Singapore, so which is great fun. So I've spent the last 2 years, just before I joined the school, working up in Beijing as the VFX supervisor at VHQ with Jean-Jacques Hano, and his latest film called Wolf Totem. He has spent nearly 3 years working on this film, raising a pack of wolves from little tiny pups all the way up to full-grown pack of about, I think, 85 wolves in the end. So really quite amazing. And he's been up in Inner Mongolia filming this for many, many years, well, the last 2 years, enduring lots of cold weather and warm weather and all sorts of amazing things. This film, I would dearly love to show you clips from this film tonight, but obviously it's not been released, so I'm not able to do that. However, I can show you some of the test work that we did for this film project to show you the sort of thing that's coming up. It's coming out in 2015, Chinese New Year, so roughly February, I think, next year. And we're all very excited about it. We're just finishing off the last little bits and pieces of it now. And as you heard in the introduction, I've done a lot of film projects. Many of them would qualify as blockbusters. Some of them would qualify more as the small sort of independent style films. Obviously, if you live in and work in the industry in London for long enough, over the last 10 years, you're going to have worked on at least one Harry Potter. I had the pleasure of working on at least 3 Harry Potters, which was great. And they were fantastic projects to work on. We're going to see quite a bit of those projects tonight. Also worked on things like John Carter, The Batman Begins. There was a little bit of work on The Dark Knight as well. And some of the smaller films too, like The King's Speech, which we'll look at in quite a bit of detail tonight. And other films like The Reader, which I was VFX supervising on. So many, many films over many years. But how did I get here? How did I actually get where I am? I think that's something that students in particular, and even my junior crew, always ask me, how did you actually get where you were? Now, when I started 20 years ago, there wasn't really a sort of computer science, well, there wasn't really a visual effects or animation degree. You couldn't really study it. The industry was very young back then. So I studied computer science. I thought I'll go into computers. I like computers. I'm going to do something with computers. And I graduated back in 1995. Did quite well. But at the time, I couldn't the only two subjects that really grabbed my attention were the last two in my degree. Topics in computer graphics and introduction to computer graphics. These involved very, very early days computer graphic generation and taught me how to write lots of basic tools like rendering engines. And for me, this was a really big revelation. This was the only part of my degree I actually really enjoyed. I was seriously questioning actually doing something else. So I went to the dean of my school and I said, could I do a sub-major in design? And she said, why on earth would you want to do a sub-major in design when you're studying computer programming? And I explained what I wanted to do, and she said, okay, well, you're doing well, so let's let you do that. And it's become an invaluable skill, and in fact, most degrees and diplomas in any sort of visual effects training now are actually created to train you in the artistic and the technical at the same time. But I started out, once I'd left the university degree, working for a software reseller who actually made graphics for, sold software that made computer graphics. And after I'd worked that for a while, he said, I want you to be a salesman. I said, no, I'm not going to be a salesman. I need to, I'm not really a good salesman. I'm actually much more interested in the software and actually making the imagery. So I left that and joined a couple of different companies in Australia, things like Acme Digital and Foxtel, and eventually moved to the UK and worked for nearly everybody that was in the UK there. Most of the industry in the UK is in London, in Soho, central London. I spent a long time at this very large company called Double Negative. Double Negative also happened to have an office in Singapore, which I helped to set up many years ago. And worked there for many years, then went to work for Cineside and Molyneux and various other places. But London was great, but I wanted a change, so I eventually moved to India and then moved to Singapore. So I started off on a little bit of a global adventure. So I'm not going to go through this in great detail, but you can see the basics. For those that already work in the industry, you'll have a bit of a grasp of some of these topics. I started as a VFX artist doing things called MATCHMOVING work. We're going to see examples of all of these, so that makes more sense. And I focused a lot on this, what we call effects work, which is creating things like fire and smoke and water, mist, natural effects and simulations. That was my real area of passion. And I started to work in this software called Houdini, which is very good at creating these sorts of effects. But I also very much enjoyed the lighting and rendering side of things. I enjoyed making the final images, making it look really good. So I tended to specialize in these disciplines within the visual effects area. And then went through the usual sort of thing. Was a team lead, a supervisor, head of 3D, VFX supervisor and senior management. That's a very typical kind of path, career path for those working in the industry. Now, computer graphics is made on a computer. So you're going to assume, well, most of it's about sitting down and actually working at a computer, right? The reality is that, although yes, a lot of the time you are sitting at a computer and working at a computer, it also involves going out on film shoots and location scouts and recce's or reconnaissance missions to have a look where you're going to shoot, what you're going to shoot. And you get to work with a lot of amazing film studios, you get to work with a lot of fantastic film crews, and this takes you all over the place. It'll take you from Dubai to Mongolia. So lots of wonderful places that you get to go. So there's actually a lot of material going back over many, many years. Lots of different styles, lots of different types of visual effects, many different films. And if you've been watching a lot of films over the last 15, 20 years, you probably spot some of those. The sort of visual effects work that I've tended to do ranges from everything, well, from one end of the scale where we would call it invisible visual effects. This is the sort of effects work where you're not actually meant to be able to tell that it's visual effects work. It succeeds if you can't see it as the audience. Right through to very obvious visual effects, such as the Harry Potter, where we can see magical effects, mist, smoke, fire, big explosions. That's obviously going to be CG, obviously going to be visual effects. But some of it, for example, the buildings in Batman Begins that you saw there, those cityscapes were completely computer generated. There was nothing real in them at all. But it only succeeded if it gave the audience the illusion that what they were looking at is actually a real image. So in fact, for the director, Chris Nolan, he wouldn't actually sign off on any of our shots until he felt that it looked absolutely real. So this was a critical thing for him. Now, Harry Potter's a different sort of story. Harry Potter, we had to make visual effects that were very obviously visual effects. They had to be magical sort of explosions. We had to have these things called Death Eaters whizzing through the air, and it involved a lot of sort of much more obvious visual effects work. So Simon put that very well, and you can see one of the key things about visual effects is detail. If we look at that harvester, for example, the number of layers, the number of different elements, little bits and pieces of particles and dust and smoke, and that all went together to make this harvester and make it look really good. That's the key to really good visual effects, all that attention to detail, all that eye for detail. And in the case of Moon, it was one of those instances where it's obviously visual effects. You know it's not the moon, but it's got to be convincing. Remember, visual effects is a storytelling tool. Visual effects is a filmmaking, a TV series making tool. And it's there to help the director to help to suspend the audience's disbelief so that they don't sort of, what they're watching, they're really into it. The moment anything sort of throws your sense of disbelief, the moment you go, that doesn't look particularly good, you lose interest in the story, you lose interest in what you're watching. So success for us is very much about making it work within a certain context. So let me tell you a little bit about King's Speech and the work we did on King's Speech at Molyneux in London. This was one of those films where it was a very small film. And a few fun facts. We began discussions on the film back in 2009. The actual film shoot was only 8 weeks. That's very small. The big films like Harry Potter, they tend to film over sort of 6 months at least. So 8 weeks, 2 months, very, very short. And the actual period that we had to do our visual effects work was only about 4 months, from June to September in 2010. But the film did incredibly well. It won 4 Oscars, 7 BAFTAs, 1 Golden Globe, and ironically, our visual effects crew on this film was only 7 people. The visual effects crew on a project like Harry Potter, it can stretch into the thousands. You can have up to 1,000 people working on this project, sometimes more. So 7 people is a very, very small number, very tight crew. But you can still do amazing things with a very small group of people. And we had 140 shots. Now, when I talk about a shot, if you're watching a film or a TV show, every time there's a change in camera angle, that's a new shot. Okay, so if you're watching a series of shots that go together, they might be filmed in this space, for example, that's called a sequence. So you'll hear people talk about shots all the time. Shot count, Avatar had 2,500 shots in it. Every time the camera changes to a different angle, a different view, cut, that's a shot, okay? Some interesting things about the King's Speech. We actually got given a budget initially that was fairly reasonable, but the budget got shrunk and shrunk and shrunk and shrunk. So by the time we finished, it actually was much smaller than we originally had planned. It's often the way that the filming takes up so much of the budget that you don't always have as much left over to do all the post-production, which is eternal frustration for us, but we've got to work with what we have. When I say period problems, I mean period setting problems. This film was filmed, well, it's meant to be a historical film, but shooting in modern-day London, you end up with all kinds of things you don't want appearing, like modern-day cars that pull up behind the back of the set, or there might be sort of, modern buildings, skyscrapers in the background. You might have power posts, power poles, all different kinds of things that you don't want to appear because they didn't appear back in the day. So we had to deal with a lot of those. And of course, the director was very, very demanding, as he should be, and most directors are. And this was really a case of a small budget film, but with very big aspirations. They wanted to do fantastic things, very much like Moon was. Moon was a very small budget film with big aspirations. So why did it do so well? What made it such a good film, and what role did visual effects play? I always say that a film will do well because, or a TV series, or even a short commercial, will do well because it has a good story. You've got to have a good story to start off with. If the story is not good, it's not going to be that interesting, no matter how beautiful you make it look. King's Speech had a really nice, heartwarming, easy to relate to story, and I think that helped it along. So our goal as visual effects artists was to make that story as compelling as possible, to make the story, to sell it to the audiences as much as possible. So visual effects, although a very small role in this film, was a very important role. And I'll show you some of the example shots, just a handful. This particular sequence, the first sequence here, we didn't do a great deal of visual effects, but we replaced a background. We did a thing called set extension. We extended a background. This particular opening speech in the King's Speech was meant to be filmed, recorded at the old Wembley Stadium and the Wembley Complex in London, which was the host for the British Empire exhibition many, many years ago. And there were these various pavilions, which we are obviously not there anymore. In fact, they're all been converted into various other venues and bits and pieces. And in fact, even the old Wembley Stadium is not there anymore. It's the brand new Wembley Stadium now. But we had the challenge of having to replace the background view out the windows with something that looked like it was set up for this British Empire exhibition. So we got lots and lots of reference. You always start with a lot of reference photography, reference images. And you try and build it up, and you create a model, you texture and paint that model to look as close as possible to how it looked back in the day. Now this is the final shot, and I'll show you the original shot before it. So there's the pavilion in the background. You can see the flags. There's people walking around. And we just zoom in. Now this is very incidental. The visual effects is not meant to stand out. It's in the background. This is the original plate. This is how they filmed it. And you can see obviously it wasn't filmed at Wembley Stadium, and there were no buildings or anything out the back. So we had to basically replace everything in that background view. It all had to be changed and replaced with CG models and little people and flags fluttering and all those sorts of effects. And another little shot as he walks up to the microphone. Again, note the old Twin Towers in the background. That's the old Wembley Stadium. But of course, in the original shot, it happened to be filmed at Leeds United Football Club. And you can see it on this, written on the screen back there on the footsteps. Somebody said to me, "Why did they film it up at Leeds? Why did they have to go that far?" And I said, "Well, it just happened to be available at the time, and they needed all the people in the foreground to be real. They needed all these guys standing up to be actual actors, and it needed to have a feel of a stadium. So we used this great big sort of canopy that hangs above the annex was real. Everything else in the back obviously had to be replaced. Now this was also very challenging because in order to remove that old original background, we had to take it out of everything, including the little springs that you see connecting the outer circle to the inner circle in the microphone. Now, pulling a background through little tiny detail of a spring is very, very difficult to do. Not something that you'd realize would be a challenge, but it becomes quite a challenge. And of course, we had to do a lot of what you call crowd replication. I can't even say it. Crowd replication. Crowd replication just means basically taking a little bit of a crowd, copying them across a whole big area and making it look like there are a lot more people. The film production didn't necessarily have the budget to pay for hundreds and hundreds of people to come along and be extras. So what we did was we took these little crowds at the side and we duplicated them. But of course we've got to be very careful of the perspective, because the angle that we view it at will determine how these guys line up in particular rows. So we had to do a little bit of trickery in our compositing work to do that. Compositing is the process of putting things together. We'll take a look at these disciplines and all this technical jargon once we've had a look through King's Speech. So similar sort of shot once again. This is mostly a challenge because we had to do crowd replication, and we had to also pull the images through this funny spring, which is also blurred in the foreground. So now this shot here was meant to be filmed in the central courtyard of Buckingham Palace. Funny enough, the Queen didn't really want us filming in there. It's not somewhere you can just roll along and say, hey, can we film in here today? They're not going to let you do that. In fact, even if you apply formally, it's very difficult to get permission, even if it's a film about one of their relatives. And if they're right behind it, it doesn't matter. It's not the sort of place you can film. And we had this sort of problem again and again with King's Speech. So with this one, we filmed this in an old stately English mansion. There's no shortage of those around England. And we made it look like it was filmed actually within the courtyard. So we fully replaced that background once again. One thing to note on this is that car that drives up to the green screen in the back and has to stop. Because if he wanted to continue driving through, he would have gone right through the green screen, and you can't do that. So unfortunately, he comes to this funny stop, but it's in the background, so we don't really notice it. Incidentally, all that tape on the windows was for the war, to stop the glass from breaking when the bombs were landing around the area. This is an example of a green screen. You'll, I'm sure, have heard or seen something to do with green screens. Green screens are really just a way of making a certain area of the background transparent, so we can put something else in place of the green color. And in this case, we have this sort of south of France background that we wanted to put in. So this one's a relatively simple shot, but the problem here was that the green screen didn't actually cover the side windows. In fact, you can see ladders and one of the crew out on the right side here. That all had to be painted out, and that's actually quite a lot of work to do. And at the same time, we had to preserve the reflections on the inside of the window. So all these little details become really important, really critical. Now, one thing that they used to have back in this particular period in history around the war were these great big dirigibles that were meant to deter bombers from actually flying over London, and they were air obstacles, if you like. So we studied these great big dirigibles, and we had to basically also study Buckingham Palace in quite a lot of detail. A couple of these next shots are all filmed around Buckingham Palace. Again, something that's very tricky to do. Now, for this next shot, we had to, again, do a background replacement. We had to put in Buckingham Palace as it might appear. So we did this matte painting. A matte painting is really what they used to do when they'd have a giant board at the back of a film, and they would paint that board. If you ever watch films back from the sort of 40s and 50s, even earlier, the actors couldn't get too close to that board in the back because they might run into it or they might see their shadow on it, that kind of thing. When they painted that big background on a board in the background, that is called a matte painting. And these days we do it digitally. We create a great big digital painting to put in the background. We put this background onto a flat card, and at first it became really obvious to us very quickly that unfortunately it wasn't going to work. It didn't have enough perspective. It looked flat. It didn't look real. It looked really strange. So we thought, okay, we're going to have to create some actual geometry. So we modeled up this building. And this is a little bit like building a miniature model. You do it in a virtual sense, though, in a sort of using this 3D software. But of course, we can't use it in just black and white. We have to put pictures on. We have to texture map it. So in order to gather textures, we just ran around London with a lot of cameras taking pictures of, well, all the historical buildings, and again, there's no shortage of historical buildings. So we took pictures of frescoes, and we took pictures of window sills and ledges, and other buildings that looked a little bit like Buckingham Palace or were nearby. And taking pictures in London is actually very challenging. If you a scene with a tripod and a camera and you're running around taking pictures, you're often stopped by police and are asked what you're actually doing. There's a degree of paranoia, probably rightfully so, in the UK, particularly in London. So not an easy thing to do. And then what we did was we took all of these components and we textured it up, which means we painted that model, and we brought it all out in a CG sense. We made it into a sort of actual CG model. And for my students, this was done in Nuke with reprojection techniques. We'll do that. And that's the final result. So we end up with something that's much more successful than just a flat painted background. And this was the original plate. You can see we had to replace nearly everything. This was filmed, incidentally, on a very wide-angle lens, 8mm lens, from a very low angle. And if you look at the front wheel of that car and the back wheel, notice how they suddenly bend, they go woo, and they roll right over. That's because we're on such a wide-angle lens to try and get as much in view as possible. Well, unfortunately, once you know that it's on a wide-angle lens, that's the only thing you see, is that funny bending wheel. We used a lot of locations around London. One location in particular is on Regent Street, or just north of Regent Street, called Portland Place. For the film, it was used for many, many interiors. And you can actually go there and see it. And even for when he walks out onto the street, this is where I'm talking about period problems. This is where, now you can see, I'm sure you can see on the original plate, we had the problem where we couldn't block off the road, and this modern silver car in the background drove up and stopped right in the shot. Normally they would be able to block off the actual street and we wouldn't have to worry about that. However, in this case, they didn't have the funds to do that, so we had to actually just deal with it later on. So we had to paint that out. Obviously, we had to do other things too. We had to add some people into the bus because the bus looked a bit empty, and we had to put some of those cars, the old cars, in the background. And a little bit of paint work to change the back, because the back of this street doesn't actually look like that. Or it didn't look like that, so we had to modify that. This is a great shot, obviously, iconic shot from the film. They're waving to their subjects loyally. However, you're not allowed to film on the actual balcony of Buckingham Palace. And in fact, we couldn't even build a set. Looking out from Buckingham Palace's balcony, obviously, we wanted to film from where the yellow arrow is. We wanted to film looking out from the balcony itself, but we couldn't do that, again, because you can't get access. So we had to film from the red arrow, which is in this place called Green Park, which also looks out to a similar view, but not quite the same. And in this shot, we wanted to look like they were looking out over their subjects, cheering and waving. But of course, we didn't have a lot of people. We only had a group of people in the bottom right corner. You can see them clustered down there. Okay? So we had to take these people and multiply them all over the place. So it's all the same people, waving, waving, waving. We actually did put some CG people in the background as well, so doing different things. So we populated it up. This is called a crowd simulation, when you populate a scene with lots and lots and lots of people. If you were looking out from Buckingham Palace, you would also know that the statue in the middle of the frame is not facing towards you. If you were on the balcony, the statue faces towards you. So I'm sure anybody that's been on the actual balcony would know that it's not actually quite correct, but we got away with that. The most difficult thing in this shot was actually changing the background behind the trees, because the trees have so much detail. Trying to remove those two trees on either side involved a lot of work, many, many hours of paint work to try and remove those. And of course, again, we had to get rid of those skyscraper buildings in the background because they didn't exist at the time. And we added things like the balloons in the background, the dirigibles. This is a fairly simple shot. This was shot against green screen in another location, but we had to shoot a still image of another particular set, which is what we did here, and we had to composite the two together. Ooh, this goes a bit fast. So, King's Speech, lots of unusual and interesting little effects, things you wouldn't really have thought were even a visual effect, would they have to have done that, but all these challenges come up time and time again. Okay, so that's a lot of examples, but how does it all work? How does this fit together? So let's go under the hood. I liken this to kind of opening up the lid of your car and looking at the engine, trying to sort of get a rough idea of how it all fits together and works. So what are all the different parts? What are their sort of major disciplines? What do they do? And how does all the information and the images that we work on flow through the companies, the visual effects companies that we work for? This is a little bit small, hopefully you can see. The first stage of filming is, for anything really, a TV commercial or a major blockbuster film, is pre-production. That's where you're planning the shoot. That's where you're hiring the directors, writing and drawing the storyboards, finishing the script. And our involvement actually starts these days right at the very earliest stages. We help in the planning, we help in the research and development. We generate test work, and I'll show you some examples in just a moment. And we start to do the modeling. We start to build the models for our creatures, our characters, our palaces, whatever it happens to be we need to build. And we do this other thing called pre-visualization, which is kind of like a digital 3D storyboard. It's a way of actually seeing what's going to happen and working out the timings, working out any technical issues we might face during the filming. And all of these things come together and actually form a sort of a template to help reduce the shooting required and to shoot things in the most optimal, efficient way. Film companies love this because it helps them to reduce their cost. So us getting involved early is a really critical thing. And then during the actual production, this is when the filming is going on, we have lots of different things to do, and you saw some references to these. We would survey the set, we would take loads of pictures of the set, we would measure it, we would take reference pictures for texturing, we would take reference pictures for lighting, we would record information about the cameras, what sort of cameras they used, what were the settings on the cameras, where were the cameras in relation to everything else. All of this sort of information is vital to our work in post-production. And then what we eventually get is a series. These days, we used to get an actual big roll of film when we were doing print film. These days, it's all digital cameras. We get a hard disk, which is about this big, and it's full of all the images from the film. And we put that onto our systems, and we start to feed it through post-production. This is what we do inside the company. And these areas in sort of pink are basically the CG areas, if you like. And this is the basic flow of information through the company. I won't go into it too much detail, but things like modeling feed into texturing, which is the painting process, which feed into look development, lighting and rendering, effects, animation, rigging. And we'll take a look at examples of all those to make more sense. And we also do this thing called compositing, which is basically taking all of the CG material and putting it together with the live material, blending it, changing the color, making it feel like it actually fits into the scene. And of course, alongside of that, we have all our management and our producers who keep the show running, and our IT people who are absolutely critical. Visual effects in CG involves huge amount of computing power. In fact, when I was at Double Negative, we had a thing called a render farm. Most big companies do. A render farm is a room full of computers. Hundreds of computers in our case at Double Negative in a big rack. Places like Weta, where they do Avatar, they have thousands of computers. It takes so much electricity up, it burns and uses so much electricity that we had so many computers running at one point that we managed to blow the substation for the whole block. We were all happily working away, and suddenly it all went quiet, and all the lights went off and everything. And they had to actually, the London Electricity had to come in and replace this substation. They had to actually take it out. And when they pulled it out of the basement, it was a big blackened, charred mess. So the power draw, the electricity used, in fact, your electricity cost is one of the biggest costs of generating visual effects. It's a lot of computing power. And of course, once you've done all this manipulation and you put your CG images back together with your live images, you have to give it back to editorial, the editing department. They then take that and give it back to the film studio or the TV production company, who then have their own editing department, and they put it together into the final product. This is just a little bit of a look at the roles and career path. We looked at this before, so I'm not going to go into too much detail, but we basically mirror the film studio or the TV production company's structure. So they have a VFX department internally, and we have a VFX structure ourselves, obviously. The top of the chain is always the VFX supervisor. They are the ones in charge of the quality of everything that goes out for the film. They work with a VFX producer and a CG supervisor, as well as a 2D supervisor who look after the different components. They have team leads underneath them, and underneath them are all the artists. Now, it's not the same in every company, but it follows this generally fairly flat structure. Okay, so what on earth is match moving? What is rigging? I'm sure those of you not working in the industry are slightly scratching your heads over these terms. So I want to show you examples so you can start to put it together. Match moving is the first thing we do. When we get the filmed footage from the client, we put it on our systems, and in order to put CG over the top of any live action, we have to recreate the same camera with the same properties and the same motion as the original camera for that shot. If we can match, that's where the match moving comes from, the movement and the properties of that camera with the real one, we can put CG onto something so that it absolutely sticks. It will not swim around and move against it. It looks like it should actually be there. And we have various bits of software that can do this. This is just a screen grab from Maya, which is showing an old custom tool we had to do it. But in essence, it's making these little, taking these little marks and markers into account that you see, these little green crosses and orange crosses, and trying to match them up to actual geometry and to match them up to an actual CG camera in our virtual environment. Just to show you what it looks like, when we overlay our test track, or our test match move over the live action, this is what we do to sort of quality check that it actually does stick. This is the first thing we do before we put any CG creatures or something wild and wonderful in the actual live action. This must stick absolutely, pixel for pixel. So we put down these little cones, and these little cones should actually be sticking to certain points of that image. They should be absolutely rigid against the image. If this is done correctly, we can say that plate has been tracked. And we can be confident that our CG is going to go into it and mix with the live action correctly. So that's the first sort of discipline. When you start out doing visual effects work, typically you will do quite a lot of match move. It's a typical entry level, but a very, very, very important role, important job. And of course, we can't do anything at all if we don't make some models. And I'm very pleased to show you this one. This one is by one of our students who is in the final year. I'm looking at my colleagues. Yes, final year. His name is Ethan Lim, and he did a model of a Ferrari that just blew me away. And I really wanted to use this as an example. He has also lit and textured it on the left, so you can see how photorealistic you can actually get your end result. So this is the software, well, a software called Maya, that one of the CG packages that we use quite a lot. And you can see the sort of thing we end up with. The model is really just like a digital sculpture, if you like. Here's another example, a digital sculpture. Now, a digital sculpture of a person or an animal isn't going to actually look that exciting. You have to be able to make it move, and you have to be able to bend it, and you have to be able to move its limbs and all of this kind of thing. The only way to really do that is to do this thing called rigging. Character rigging is the process of putting a skeleton or a bone, a control structure, into that model. And different parts of that bone structure, just like our bone structure, influence regions of that model and allow us to bend and manipulate and deform. So you can see the wireframe of the model over the top. And she's shown us, this is Leonie, one of our students, she's shown us a really nice example of the sorts of controls that we have to put onto our model. So you need controls for the toe, for the leg, for the arms, for the hands. without these controls, nothing would be actually animatable. Nothing could be animated. Even down to the eyes and the face and the eyebrows, everything has to have something influencing that model to allow us to move it. You could think of it almost as like little magnets that attach to parts of the body, and as you move the magnet, it deforms that model and it pulls the face or the nose or something like that around. So rigging is a very technical area. It's the process of actually setting up that control system. This then gets passed to animators, who are very highly skilled at making things move in a believable, realistic way. So they work very closely together. Now we have other people who specialize in painting, texture painting, for example. And this is an example of a test work that we did at Double Negative for Harry Potter 5, I think, which is Order of the Phoenix. We had this character called Grawp. Grawp is a Hagrid's half-giant brother. Brother? Cousin? One of those, I forget. But in order to win the work, we had to convince Warner Brothers that we could actually generate a realistic-looking giant with real-looking skin and real-looking expressions. So I put this test together with a few friends of mine at Double Negative, and we one of the key aspects was making sure that the skin was very realistic. So we painted these enormous texture maps. Texture maps obviously look very strange because they've been unwrapped. It's a bit like taking your face and kind of unwrapping it onto a rectangular grid. I like to think of it like an animal's pelt or a skin. If you were to take an animal's skin and stretch it out, you just imagine, like, you know, the big sort of bear rugs that you get. When you're laid out on the ground, they all look a bit sort of strange and squished out. It's exactly the same process. If you wrapped it all back onto the object, it would fit perfectly. But when it's unwrapped onto this funny sort of map, it looks a bit strange. But we have to paint everything from the sort of color maps to specialist maps like the black and white one. The black and white one actually is defining the areas of the skin where it's shiny or not shiny. So where it's white, it's going to be less shiny. Where it's black, it's actually going to be more shiny in this case. So the area around his lips is a little darker because we want his lips to appear a bit wet. And when you put all this together with some nice lighting and shading and various other tricks, you end up with something like this. And we just did what was called a facial rigging test. We ran it through a whole series of expressions and emotions just to see, would it break? Does it hold together? Does it look real? You know, is he actually giving you a feeling? You know, is he conveying an emotion? So he's happy, he's sad, he's tired. We tried all different side of things. Surprised, you know. And you can see his lips are a little bit wet. He's got a little bit of sort of shine on the lips. And this is all down to the texture maps and materials that we put onto this model. Now, this is a little preview of a test work that we did for Wolf Totem up in Beijing. And in order to win the work on Wolf Totem, we had to convince my French director, Jean-Jacques Hinault, who is a lovely man, that we could actually do the work, and we could give him a realistic-looking wolf and a realistic-looking gazelle, which up in Mongolia, this is the wolf's food. This is what they eat. And this draws together all of those things. This is a model. We've had to animate it. We've had to rig it. And the key challenge here was, in the test work at least, was to make it as realistic as humanly possible. All these little details, the head movements, the ears, the flick of the head, the nose, even the nostrils flaring as it breathes, all very important. And of course, we couldn't show him a grayscale, which is what we call those images, because it is in gray. We had to show him with actual fur, so we put on CG fur, and we had to light it and render it to make it fit into this environment. We had to add ground shadows, all of those sorts of things. But lots of detail, even the ribs, because these sheep are kind of, well, they call them sheep up in China. I said, what do they call something young? And they said, oh, they're wolf food, they're sheep. But these creatures, these gazelles, actually are quite skinny, so they always had the ribs showing, you know. So we had to go down to details like being able to see the ribs. And of course, for the film, we had to make wolves, CG wolf. Because although they had real wolves, there are certain situations where you can't actually use a real wolf. When they get close to horses, for example, and there were horses in the film too. Because one of the food sources for the wolves are horses. And wolves actually quite like to attack horses, even if they see a horse and they're a relatively trained wolf, instinct takes over and they do actually go for the horse. So the director had to keep the wolves and the horses in the film very separate. But there are whole scenes where we're meant to see the wolves attacking the horses. So for the health and safety of the horse and for the health and safety of the wolves, we had to make absolutely sure that we had a CG option instead, so we could use those instead of the real things. So we modeled up and made a CG wolf. In fact, we built it on about 3 or 4 variations of the real wolf. And this shows you a couple of things in one go. This is what we see when we do look development, which is the ability to, this is our assessment of how that particular asset, this particular wolf, is going to look. You can see we've got the texture maps in the little black square, so it's all unwrapped, just like a pelt. And you can see the model of the wolf on the right. Notice that the actual length of the fur on the model, which is all CG fur, is also very critical for the shape. Because if you take all the fur off a wolf, it actually looks a bit like a dog, very thin greyhound. And we had no way of actually getting any reference for what a skinned wolf would look like, because their fur and even their skin itself is quite thick. So we had to sort of guess as best we could. Even the little detail, like the very fine black hairs that stick up a little bit higher than the rest of the wolf's fur, we had to make sure we included that. And it worked very, very, very well. Like I said, I'd love to show you more than that, but we'll have to see the film when it comes out. The other thing we do a lot of research and development work. It's not the sort of industry where we just sit back and say, well, we know how to do this, we'll just keep doing it over and over and over and over. It's a fairly young industry. It's only really been going for about 40 or 50 years. And research and constant research is very critical, and in fact it's a key part of any company's work. So here's an example of some research we did for Harry Potter. We wanted to actually record and recreate a whole mountainside for use in the background of a couple of the shots. Now we could have just modeled up a texture and we modeled a mountain, painted the texture, modeled a mountain, put it all together and said, there you go. But Warner Brothers really wanted to make it, make use of an actual mountain in Scotland. So in order to do that, we had to come up with a new way of actually generating a model from a photograph, and this is called photogrammetry. It's an amazing technique. And the actual shoot was done by this friend of mine, that's Pietro Ponti from Double Negative. He's a VFX supervisor there. We got our research and development guys to generate this special rig for these digital SLR cameras. There's three Canon cameras there. And we developed a special rig whereby when you press a button, all 3 cameras go off at the same time and capture 3 images at exactly the same instant, which generates a very, very big picture. And we use that in a couple of different ways. Now, to shoot this with this technique, we actually had to fly around the mountain in a helicopter, obviously, stopping at different points to take photos every few angles, looking down at the same mountain. So we're sort of hovering around it like that in an arc. And the sort of photos we got, well, these are the photos we got from the imagery, some of the photos at least. So we'd take maybe 20 different positions going around the mountain, and we would use these photos to generate a model. The reason we wanted 3 cameras is we needed a very high resolution image, great big picture. And you can see different angles there give us different effects. Now the way this method works, it analyzes the difference between these pictures to generate a model. And that's the final model that we ended up with in CG. And you can see our camera positions there as well in green. When we put our original photographs back as a texture map on the model, you end up with a section of a mountain, basically, which is highly detailed and highly realistic. And this then gets used in the actual shot. This is the test shot from Double Negative. And you can see the mountain in the background, and in the foreground is our digital model of Hogwarts, which is the school. So, seems like an awful lot of effort to make a mountain in the background, but it gave us the ability to actually fly right up close to the mountain in CG if we wanted to, and we'd still have a load of detail, right down to very small sort of 30 centimeter size rocks. So quite a technique. All right, so that's most of the material. People always ask me, what sort of companies actually do this work, and of course there are many around the world. Some of them you will know very, very well. Companies like Pixar and Disney, well, actually the same company, Pixar, Disney. Some of them you may know from things like Avatar, Weta Digital, for example. And locally, we've got branches of companies like Double Negative, who are one of the very, very big visual effects companies these days. But also companies like Framestore in London, the moving picture company, Cinesight, who I've worked for on the Project Moon that we saw. And of course, Lucasfilm, ILM, one of the founding companies in the industry, been going for many years, and wonderful company. And there are lots of smaller, mid-sized companies around the place as well. So not just these great big ones. In Singapore, we have Double Negative Singapore and Lucasfilm Singapore, the two major companies doing this sort of work. And of course, companies like VHQ, who I've worked for, who have offices around the region, as well as Singapore. And there are many different games companies too, Namco, Konami, many, many different companies, all different sizes, working on everything from TV commercials to animated series like Sparky Animation, or working on great big blockbuster films. So there's everything right through the entire scale. And visual effects started primarily in sort of California, Los Angeles, but these days, as an industry, it's developing very rapidly in lots of different places around the world. In particular, there's a lot of development in Canada, places like Vancouver and Montreal, and India is going through a bit of a boom in the industry, as is China. The Chinese film industry at the moment is enormous. They're building more and more cinemas. I think 3,000 cinemas across China last year alone, and they're screaming out for content. They want more films, more pictures to go in. And Singapore has been going through many years, a lot of development in this industry, which is great. I'll just finish with a little quick bit about the school that I'm spending most of my time with, and I'm happy to say I joined after the Jean-Jacques project. We've built up a brand new program aimed at developing the more sort of technical artists, something that the industry is absolutely hungry for, desperately hungry for, but not something that gets taught much. So I had discussed this with the guys at 3D Sense for many years, and we finally found the right time to bring this course to life. School here has been going for many, many years, 11 years, which is fantastic. Great track record. It is a WDA, Workforce Development Authority, CET Center. I was appointed that back in 2009. And I think the motto of the school is very fitting for the industry. I think it's very much in keeping. To work in this industry, you have to have passion. You've got to love what you do. You're going to work a lot of long hours, and you're going to be up against tight deadlines, so you've got to absolutely love what you're doing. And you've got to have a real passion for making beautiful images, a passion for making things look great. This passion leads to a really intense focus, you know. You need to be very focused on what you're doing. You need to really stick at it to make it work. And this focus brings out a sense of drive, you know. This brings out the motivation to really do what you want to do. All of these elements are absolutely critical in this industry. It's only through a combination of passion, focus, and drive that you end up with excellence. And in order to succeed and to continue to succeed and to really get the most out of this industry and to stay ahead of the competition, you have to be producing excellent work. You have to be producing the best work. You can't just settle for second best. If the audience look at a movie and they see, it's not so good, who made that? Not going to use them again. It's very, very demanding that way. And people from the school, people from the school have working all over the place. They're working locally as well as around the region and internationally. School has won many awards. Of course, it's one of the top 10 schools globally, which is what attracted me to work with the guys. And it's a great place to do. I think we're built up some very solid ties with the local companies and are approved for working with people like Pixar and Pixar's RenderMan courses. And we have great, very strong ties, obviously, for my own connections as well with Double Negative and Lucasfilm. So just a little bit of information there. There's some information on the courses. If you want to know more about that, you can certainly contact me afterwards. And you can contact me or reach me on my many different means. I tried to simplify it. I tried to make my Twitter, Skype, Facebook, and LinkedIn all Dayne Cowan. So if you want to connect up and you want to see, just do a search on Dayne Cowan, or you can email me on any of these. So that's it. I hope that gave you a little bit more of an insight into how we make these blockbuster movies, the sorts of things we go through and the amount of work it takes to bring this sort of material to the public. It's not something that's sort of very quick and easy to do. And yeah, so hopefully that's sparked your interest in this industry and given you some food for thought. I think we've got time.
Thank you very much, Dayne Cowan, for a very exciting presentation. So I'd like to open the floor for Q&A. So do you have any questions for Mr. Dayne Cowan?
Easy ones, please.
Easy ones.
Hi. Oh Christ.
That's loud.
I work in advertising.
Okay.
And I often find that you have an end client, and then you have your digital effects artists, and there's often a very big gap between the two, and a lot gets lost in translation. Yes. Now, I'm assuming in your business, the director is the end client.
Yes.
So how do you manage the communication between the director and his expectations, or her expectations, and what you're delivering?
Very, very good question. Yeah. It's a big challenge. Yeah. As much as it is for advertising, it's just as much of a challenge for filmmaking or TV series, anything with a director. The process usually is that you have, on these very big projects, we have a VFX supervisor in-house. If we go back to that slide with the VFX supervisor. The VFX supervisor is really the sort of internal boss of the project. They're responsible for that project. They're also basically the person that liaises directly with the client. And what we try to do is get the VFX supervisor to, we try to make sure they're actually drawn in as part of the film crew as early as possible. In fact, it's so important that we send the visual effects supervisors out to the film set. We send them out to spend time with the film crew, the director of photography, all of these people, even the producers, so that they get to know them. And in fact, we've often had to change VFX supervisors on a project if they didn't connect well with the director, or if they didn't understand the director. It's really, the VFX supervisor's got to get into the director's head. So they've got to know what they want. They've got to know the kind of thing they want. So for example, on Wolf Totem, we were very, very lucky. On Wolf Totem, they didn't actually have many layers between us and me personally and the director. The director would, Jean-Jacques Hano, would come in to see us and to see the work, and we'd sit in our preview theatre and watch the material, and he would directly comment on the work and give us feedback, which was fantastic, because normally a director is surrounded by an entourage of people, and there's layers like the best directors to work with actually are the ones that will try and push the entourage aside and come directly to speak to you and tell you what you need.
Same with the client.
Yeah. The not so good ones are the ones that sit back and kind of surround themselves with loads of layers of people, and then you can't get access to them and you don't know quite what they want. And yeah, there's no way around that. That's just very difficult. But we had unprecedented access to Jean-Jacques Hano in this Wolf Totem project, which was amazing. And it was just the nature of the situation in China, the fact that he was there, and most of the Chinese crew only spoke Chinese, so he spoke English and French, so he saw us and went, aha, great, I can talk directly to you. So we were lucky that way. But, you know, working with someone like Chris Nolan's also very good at just coming directly to the VFX supervisor and saying, right, I want this. Now, the other thing that tends to happen is once you've worked on a few films, the directors tend to ask the companies for that same supervisor. They say, I like that one, I want to work with that one. He understands or she understands me. They know what I want. And so you almost get sort of tied into the project that way. Directors, I mean, in the terms of the process, it's very straightforward. We watch the material. The director would sit down and tell us what he'd want. In terms of Wolf Totem, we actually went out to the film studio, sat in the edit suite, and he went through all of the sequence he wanted us to work on. And we filmed it with a camera so we could recall it all later. And he sat there and described everything he wanted. It was just like a great brain dump, and he just described everything he wanted for every single shot. So we could go back and watch the video afterwards and go, right, what did he say there? He needed that and that and that. Of course, directors have changed their mind too, so he might come back a few months later and say, no, I don't want that. But that's the creative process, so that's okay. You accept that. But it can be a challenge. The biggest challenge for me actually in China was the fact that my Mandarin is terrible. I only speak a little bit, and I had a translator, and she got very good at understanding the jargon and the technical terms. But equally, getting the sort of very artistic descriptions across was very challenging. Trying to explain, you know, it's got the right feel, but it's not quite, you know, zingy enough. You can't translate that very easily. So that was
more wow factor, right?
Yeah, you do actually, and things would get lost in translation. Sometimes I'd talk to my crew and say, right, I mean, essentially once the VFX supervisor has the briefing, they, or myself, someone like myself, would have to go to the crew and say, right, here's what the director wants, and then I have to put it in terms they would understand. So I'm kind of, or any VFX supervisor is kind of like the translator. You've got to translate the sort of film speak or the TV speak into technical terms that the artists will understand as well.
Very, very quick tech question as well, if I can squeeze it in,
Sure.
which is, we're looking at the moment about basically going to all 4K cameras, not because anyone watches 4K, but because of the flexibility in post, where you can punch in, punch out, create movement, blah, blah, blah.
Yep.
I'm wondering about the role of the DOP now. Is it just keep it still and film it flat, or do they still have a role to play in terms of the settings and the movement of the camera?
Oh no, they still very much play a role. Advertising, I'm not as familiar. I haven't worked with many DPs on TV commercials, but in the film realm, the DPs are still all powerful in terms of what camera we use. They don't choose the stock so much anymore. They don't say we'll use, you know, this particular type of print or this sort of thing. But they're still very active in sort of, you know, we'll use an Arri Alexa, or we're going to use this particular format. And most DPs in the film are in charge of all the lighting as well, so how the film is lit and the photography is done. So very wide-reaching power in film. My favorite DP of all time, Roger Deakins, amazing guy, and he just gives the films a particular look and feel, you know, that just it's like a signature style. You can tell it straight away. In fact, most of the directors are so particular about which DP they want to use. They'll have a favorite, and they'll always go back to that favorite. For example, Roger Deakins is always used by the Cowan brothers because they love the way he does it. So it's kind of a long-term working relationship. And yeah, I think they've still got an awful lot of power. I mean, anybody working in lighting and rendering for visual effects is actually a virtual director of photography. So anybody working in that discipline, I always encourage to go out and do a lot of photography and learn about how to light scenes and how light works and interacts, and how it can set a mood or a feeling. So, but 4K is a strange one. We still don't do a lot of shooting in 4K, although I can see technically it would be brilliant because you could punch in and out and all that kind of thing. It's very technically useful, but it's a little bit of a nightmare, like 8K is for visual effects, because the images get bigger and bigger and bigger in size. It means that we need a lot more computer processing power. We're probably going to blow a lot more substations and all that sort of thing, because working on a 2K image, for example, takes a certain amount of processing power. Working on a 4K takes even more. Working on stereo 4K, which is 2 sets of 4K images, takes even longer again. So it adds a lot of time to the post-production process, working with these bigger images. But, you know, the quality is much better, so you can't argue with better quality. I mean, that's ultimately the goal. Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Any more questions from the floor?
Hi, I've got a quick question. The first one is, are we still going to see 3D films, or are they just a passing phase?
Ah, that's the big question.
The second question, oh, sorry, I have two
No,
questions.
carry on. Second question?
The
Yes.
second question is on the nature of the industry. I'm a fund manager, so I tend to look at the what trends there are in the entertainment industry as well. And I think a couple of years back, there were a couple of visual effects companies that kind of went on strike or did the green screen strike and saying we're not capturing enough of the value chain.
Yes.
I've also seen companies in the US go bust very quickly after their IPO.
Yes.
Including one school in the Western United States. So
That's right.
maybe you could have some
I can certainly
observations
comment.
and comments.
Yeah, sure, absolutely. It's been going through a lot of growing pains, the industry, I think. It's a challenging time. I think the trouble is VFX started out as an industry where, because it's relatively young, it was always the young sort of new thing on set. So as part of the old traditional film crew, they always viewed it with a little bit of sort of, it looks handy and very useful, but it's viewed with a bit of suspicion and sort of, originally in the old days, there's a bit of a nuisance. It's like, visual effects is on set. What do you need? What are you interrupting us and trying to get? What do you need here? I don't understand, you know. So there was a lack of understanding about visual effects because it was such a new thing, and it wasn't part of the old traditional filmmaking process. That's changed very rapidly. I mean, when I first worked with Chris Nolan, he didn't like visual effects at all. He didn't want to use visual effects. He wanted to use models and miniatures, actual practical effects. But we convinced him over a series of Batman films that actually it's a good thing to do, and he's now obviously a very big fan. Well, maybe not a big fan, but he will use visual effects very, very happily. Unfortunately, I think what visual effects has suffered from is not so much the actual, it's not the work itself. It's suffered from very naive business practices. A lot of these companies would happily go in, and originally we would go in with a certain film budget. We would be given a certain budget, and we would say, okay, to do 200 shots, it will take us 8 months, and it might cost £1 million, something like that. But then what happens in filmmaking, and particularly with visual effects, the client would come in and want endless changes, and visual effects companies would give them endless changes. Now, every time there's a change, you would find that costs you money. That takes you, it costs you for your crew, it costs you for the equipment, for the power. And so you can't keep giving away all these endless changes for free. And I think that VFX didn't take enough of a stand early on and lay down a framework of like, okay, we'll give you so many changes for free, but then it has to be actually a change request. You have to actually start paying for additional changes and paying for these additionals. And I think we had a few very unscrupulous companies who would go in and undercut everybody and say they could do it for absolutely almost nothing. Yes, we'll give you unlimited changes. Yes, we'll give you everything. And of course, that was very attractive for the film studios. They would come in and say, great, here's a great, cheap option. Well, let's use it. And understandably, it makes business sense. But unfortunately, with visual effects, you get what you pay for. If you pay for low quality, you won't get high quality. And often what would happen is that company would go out of business, they go bust, and purely through a bad business model, really. And what would happen is the work would have to be done by some other company, probably back at the original cost. So it would end up costing the company the same amount of money to do. And there was a trend of that for a few years. But a lot of the studios are always looking for the cheapest possible option. They want to cut their costs, and that's an understandable thing. But I think the visual effects companies also need to be standing up to that to a point and saying, we need to survive as an industry. You need to actually assist us in that process and not play to this constant sort of undercutting. Yeah. The model itself, I think, needs changing for the companies from a business perspective. I think, and you see this more and more, what's actually happening is the big companies are actually now getting involved in the actual film rights process. They actually invest and co-invest in the films themselves. They become a stakeholder. Once you're a stakeholder, it's a completely different story. That way the visual effects can be run as more of a cost center than a sort of profit-generating exercise. That's a model that I'm seeing being done more and more, and it works much better in general. So far. I think I've seen it a lot in China. A lot of the Chinese companies will do the visual effects, but then they will also co-invest in the actual film and the distribution of the film, and that's ultimately where the money making is. And I think that keeps everybody much more stable. So you see a lot of the big companies these days in visual effects are changing their model to move more into the production process. And in fact, if you look at companies like Disney and Pixar, they are already a film studio, so it doesn't particularly matter for them. So the structure of the industry is changing. I honestly think it's just part of the growing pains of the company. We've seen a lot of work move away from the US because of these, it's cheaper to do it elsewhere, sort of cost reasons. Seen it move to places like China and India, but what's actually happening in China and India is that as my crew in China, for example, got more and more experienced, they naturally wanted higher and higher salaries. So the cost is going up and up and up. And in places like India, the cost and skill level are going up and up and up. I think it will ultimately rebalance, because the costs have come down in North America and Europe, costs are going up in China and India, and it will start to sort of actually find somewhere in the middle. In fact, I've even seen cases of work going back from China and India back to America, where they're doing it in America now, because and it's a little bit painful for the practitioners, for the artists, to see the work moving around like that. But I think it's just unfortunately it's a stage in the growth of the industry, and I think the manufacturing industries have gone through similar sorts of things. But you can't treat this sort of industry like a manufacturing industry. It's not. You can't just pump out lots and lots of good quality images. You've got to still. It's an art. It's a creative industry, and yeah, it's part of the ongoing saga we have with our clients in the industry, I guess.
Thank you. Any more questions from the floor? How about the students?
The other question, the first question. CG, yes, 3D. So
Sorry.
I often mix up 3D and CG because I used to call CG 3D work, but 3D is in stereoscopic. I think personally it's still a phase. That is my personal opinion. It's not everybody believes that. Mainly because stereoscopic as a technique first came out in the 1940s, 1945, something like that. So it's been around for a long time. It's had these revivals every 10, 15 years. It comes back into fashion, and everybody wants to do CG films, and that's the way to do it. I personally think the limiting factor of stereoscopic is the glasses. I find them so irritating to wear. Friends of mine that wear glasses every day find them excruciatingly annoying to wear because they wear glasses on glasses, and it's just, I think for the actual technology to stick and become mainstream, I think we need some sort of development whereby the screens themselves are actually watchable in a stereoscopic sense without the glasses, and from anywhere in the cinema, because stereoscopic as it stands, you still have to get the best experience. You still have to be sitting in a very specific spot in the middle of the cinema. I think it's a great fun thing, but when you abuse stereo, when you accidentally push the depth too far, it can actually make people sick. In fact, my old boss at Cinesight, she was our litmus paper. She was our test. If we'd set up a scene in stereo and we were thinking, is it good? Does it work? Does it make you feel unsettled, or is it comfortable? All we'd have to do is show it to her and let her sit, and she would immediately feel like throwing up if she watched the scene and it was too deep or it was badly set up. So I think because it's trying to trick the brain, and the brain is trying to do things that it finds a little bit challenging, and that can make people feel very unsettled. So my personal feeling is I think it'll go away again, and it'll come back again. It'll go away again and come back again. But I'd really like to see it whereby the actual screens somehow show the 3D effect without the glasses. I think that's the next stage. Maybe at that stage it will stick, yeah. That's my own personal opinion.
Well, thank you very much. I think that will be our last question for the night. But before that, can I just give a token of appreciation to Mr. Dayne Cowan? Let's give him a round of applause. So that's it for the night. We hope to see you guys again on our next Prominent Speaker Series. Thank you very much and have a great evening.